There it goes. So just aim that towards us. You see?
Okay.
My mic's working. I need to bring my paper.
You've got something written down, Bob? What's going on?
Years of preparation.
Years of preparation. Okay, it's 9 minutes past 4 in the afternoon on the 20th of August at the 22nd Zappanale, and you're about to hear the Bob and Ben Show. Jim Cohen announced us as the Ben and Bob Show from the stage. That's incorrect. It's the Bob and Ben Show. I named the show, so in honour of Bob, I put his name first on purpose. It's the Bob and Ben Show, and we have done 36 hours of radio together. We simply talk. We think talking about music is the next stage after music. Because I frequently interrupt Bob, I promised him to give him 10 minutes uninterrupted time to expound his view of Zappa and why we're here. So over to you, Bob.
Is it clear? Everybody can hear me at the back? Okay. Never have I witnessed so many stupid people celebrating a stupid composer and having a great time at it.
Thank you.
I await response. No response. This is a quote that Frank Zappa made back in 71 or so, the time he announced his conceptual continuity. No one seemed to notice it. He said, "Now disregarding if you can, whatever your political views may be, mine are, I'm partly communist and partly fascist, with a distinct streak of monarchism in my Marxism, but at bottom anarchist with a healthy passion for order." No one ever picked up on that quote. You notice the dynamic there? There's a four-way interplay of relationships there. You got monarchism in his Marxism, anarchism in his healthy passion for order, and he's a communist sometimes, fascist at other times. Now, the hidden pattern for this is the sensory interplay known as tactility. Tactility is not the sense of touch. It's the interplay of the senses, not a particular sense in itself. And the main pattern for the electric environment is the extension of the tactile sense, an interplay, not any particular senses. So what we have, thanks to Ben, he pointed out to me once that the Renaissance of the 1920s was painting. That was the revolutionary art form, got a lot of attention in reaction to movies, radio, and automobiles, and newspapers. So we can see the 20s were emphasizing the eye. The eye was the first reaction to the interplay of electric tactility. Then we have the next revolution, Ben points out, in the 60s, where it shifts to the ear. Rock music, avant-garde music, all kinds of experiments with sound around ear. That was the ear's response, a familiar sense, as people encountered the tactile interplay of the global theater, which means satellite, computers, radio, newspaper, television, and the beginning of the digital. That interplay retrieved a renaissance in ear experience, just like the 20s retrieved a renaissance in eye experience. Now, Ben has wondered what comes next. Well, with the digital computer world, where people actually have a chance to speak back to the media that's presented to them, it's not a one-way broadcasting situation, that essentially is a tactile interplay, but with more and more consumer control of what the content of that interplay is. So we have that tactility becomes a figure in the 80s and 90s until now. Think of this interacting by digital extensions and digital extended people playing with the eye and all the archive of media that the eye created in the 20th century, mixed in with the archive of media around the ear, and then newspapers, and then books, and video images. So this whole mixture that people can start to edit and play with since the 90s is tactility itself becoming the form of response to whatever you call this weird media world that people have been in for 30 years. So I see that the third renaissance is the retrieval of tactility itself since the 90s, where people can play with any sensory modality and have a sense of editing themselves and have a sense of autonomy. The autonomy happened more in Web 2.0 than it did in Web 1.0. So in this tactile situation that we have extended all around us over the last 25 years, I propose that Frank Zappa was not an eye man, he was not an ear man, he was a tactile man. And he could use any form of experience and call it music. He could compose with his ashtray. Now when you look at his statement in Hot Rats, this movie for your ears, 1969, he is still reacting to the ear dynamic of the 60s, but he has a heavy visual bias, being an artist himself, a designer, drawing since he was a kid, drawing his scores. There's Frank reacting to the tactile environment, but it apparently seems that he's a musician working with visual editing schemes. You can see this in his interview with Barry Miles in International Times magazine, August, September 1969. That's a good explanation of that phase, but little people realize that Frank was going to drop the Mothers, move into a new phase in the 70s. You have this lull with the Turtles producing more theatrical events, which is another part of eye visual culture. Does that for a year and a half or so. Then he has his accident, and then he comes bursting forth in 73 and 74, featuring work with video. He was hoping to get on the Playboy channel the piece called A Token of My Extreme. Now here's Frank beginning to play with interactivity and to hoik up not the eye or the ear around the movie dynamic or even the radio dynamic. He was moving into tactility as presented by television, and that's where Bruce Bickford comes in. Any Baby Snake or any Bickford production is nothing but fluidity, metaphorsing and metamorphing and playing with all the sensory dynamics of his clay work. Now the shifting and mutating is the best the eye can see of tactility. You can't see the interplay of sensory work known as tactility, but the best expression of that is constant movement shifting, shape-shifting almost, that Bruce Bickford presented. So there's a whole new aesthetic that Frank is presenting in the 70s, featured and emphasized around Bruce Bickford. And he also gets more fluid in the way he, as Ben calls it, his corporate rock phase in the 70s and early 80s. Then what does Frank do? In the 80s, he moves into digital work, retreats from active performance, and starts playing with what he called digital dust. Now he's really getting into tactility, but it's a virtual form of tactility. So, that's what I'm proposing here. That the way to understand Frank, his conceptual, philosophical background, to the degree there could be any, since any form of human expression would be the content of his presentation, the actual form is the tactile interplay of anything for, what is that quote, Ben? Anything available anywhere, blah, 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 God, composition, chord. Remember 1969, read that book, maybe you know it? The first one, the...
Anything at all, any time,
any available medium.
with no excuses. I can't remember it either. Can you
Not
remember?
the anything, anytime, not anywhere.
No, another one.
Yeah, any available medium, the big note, God. He says, it lists all the senses. A couple of big things. That's his first mixed media statement about 1969. It's in Dave Wally's book. It came out in the early 70s. The point is that we see that the revolution of the last 30 years, the extension of tactility itself, Frank was in the foreground of that. This is how you understand Frank in the 70s and the 80s and 90s, is Frank, the tactile engineer, more and more making tactility the metaphor for how he saw what was happening to everybody. He was not an eye man anymore, he was not an ear man. Now, there's a very good quote by Carl Reagan, who, discussing James Joyce's Ulysses, said something. This is how I adapt that quote. Carl Reagan's quote would apply to this, to Frank, at least in the early 70s period. A heap of dung crawling with musicians, photographed by a television apparatus through a microscope. Okay? quote done 60 years before, let's say, by Carl Radick, who died about 1947, killed in the Gulag or whatever. That quote leads to the point, Ben has discussed the movie 200 Motels as about rubbish. Now, Ben likes to point out Theodore Adorno as a conceptual parallel to Zappa. I propose Marshall McLuhan, because Marshall McLuhan was the philosopher who explained tactility and how it was extended through television. So if you look at Marshall's work, Frank did not play with time. He discussed decorating time, but that was not really what he was doing. He was shaping time, in other words, shaping space. And this is where Ben brings up the word esoplastic, a shaping of things into one. That is exactly what tactility could be, a shaping of all the senses into a coherent sense of consciousness. That what you see is organized by your tactile interplay. So the organizing of spaces that the different senses create, the playing of the ear space, the eye space, and then later the tactile space, is the essence of Frank's agenda. So that you can include these ideas, these phrases. Frank Zappa makes people dumb. He does that with cellular signaling. He eschews, does not focus on the univocal approach or bias. And every Zappa concept, percept, and musical rhythm comes from Finnegan's Wake. Finnegan's Wake is the first book that is full-blown tactility in print. You cannot read with your eyes Finnegan's Wake. You can mix your senses, eye, ear, touch, smell, and kinesis, with Finnegan's Wake, and then you get the rhythm of it. There's so much of what Frank did in the 70s and 80s as a translation of the dynamics of Finnegan's Wake. Ben wrote recently that, no, maybe it was in 2008, he wrote that Bob Dobbs, has the advantage of recognizing that Frank Zappa is the James Joyce of electronic media. That's a very accurate statement if you understand electronic as a tactile apparatus, playing with all the senses and their extensions. When you get into some of the theatrical elements like cyborg or the robotic or some of the virtual characters in Them or Us, that screenplay, you start to see Frank working not just with the senses, but whole landscapes of technologies. And the digital, the synclavier was the best way to do that. And I think if you look at the cover of Civilization Phase 3, you see a big rock, you see UFOs, sort of things coming in, you see a photo of New York City, you see, what else, Ben? You see Roman stuff. It's a mixture of landscapes. And so it has a patina of blackness, because Marshall McLuhan said, since tactility is not a color, the only way you can present tactility visually is use the image of black. Black is the absolute color.
My perception of Phase 3 is it's all Egyptian, scarabs, pyramids. I don't see much other civilization there. It seems to be almost entirely Egyptian, isn't it?
No, you'll see the, I live in New York City, you recognize the aerial view of New York City embedded in the cover. But the Egyptian is that's relevant.
Yeah.
Marshall McLuhan said that the pharaohs, they shaped whole cultures. He said the art of the 20th century tends back towards the Egyptian. Now this is very interesting how young Frank Zappa, I mean, he was born 30 years after Marshall McLuhan, but many of Frank's ideas were like a popular translation of Marshall McLuhan, even though Frank did not have that detailed acquaintance of Marshall McLuhan. He had read a couple of his books and had nobody to talk about it with other than me, but he picked up on the tactility and the Egyptian nature. This is the Cletus Aurelius mode. The Egyptian art takes the whole environment and programs it. Frank's intercontinental absurdities, United Mutations, and his emperor aristocratic demeanor was him processing the whole range of content in the global theater, just as Joyce did with Finnegan's Wake, just as Burroughs tried to do. Frank was the only one doing it music. Everybody got consumed and absorbed into Frank's dynamic. That is, McLuhan said, an Egyptian style of art, programming the whole world. So now, I don't know if Frank knew McLuhan said that, but again, he picked up on the point about it being Egyptian, programming the whole environment. And that is what I call a satellite conductor. The popular mythology.
2 minutes?
I'm going to come in soon.
Okay. This is what I do. I work Ben up. I mean, it just has to start swinging, you know. So it's coming close. I have other parts I'll develop later. But to end, I'll quote T.S. Eliot's definition of the auditory imagination, and I'll put in Zappa's name. What I call Frank Zappa is the feeling for syllable and rhythm penetrating far below the conscious levels of thought and feeling, invigorating every word, sinking to the most primitive and forgotten, returning to the origin and bringing something back, seeking the beginning and the end. It works through meaning, certainly, or not without meanings in the ordinary sense, and fuses the old and obliterated, and the trite, the current, and the new and surprising, the most ancient, Egyptian, and the most civilized mentality, Los Angeles. That is the auditory imagination which had become ordinary awareness, McLuhan said, by 1970. What was not part of ordinary awareness was the imagination of fitting its weight. But Frank started to sculpt that in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Okay, let's see if we can start a little bit.
I don't want to compete with the music on the stage. I think it's just going to be too hard. So, Mr. Bob Dobbs, thank you very much.
I'll continue. I'll compete against the stage. But they maybe just, let's say they work it out. Go for 10 minutes, because they've been diddling around it.
Yeah, they're just diddling around doing that ego thing of musicians, like showing that they can tune their instruments for us.